The air over Germany in 1943 was a graveyard for the Flying Fortress. For the crews of the 8th Air Force, the myth of the B-17's invincibility had been shattered by a single, terrifying discovery made by the Luftwaffe. German pilots, studying the downed carcasses of American bombers, had found a fatal blind spot. While the B-17 bristled with .50 caliber machine guns in the tail, waist, and top turret, its nose, the glass conservatory housing the bombardier and navigator, was virtually naked. It was defended only by a single, flimsy .30 caliber gun on a flexible mount, difficult to aim and lacking the punch to stop a charging fighter. The Luftwaffe response was swift and brutal. They stopped attacking from the rear, where the tail gunners lay in wait, and began the 12 o'clock high attack. German fighters would scream in from directly ahead, closing at 600 miles per hour, pouring 20mm cannon shells into the unprotected glass nose. The results were catastrophic. Bomber formations were decimated. Morale plummeted. The B-17, designed to be a self-defending fortress, was being slaughtered. What happened next was not a solution from the engineers at Boeing or the generals in the Pentagon, but a desperate, grease-stained innovation born on the rainy airfields of England. It was a modification that would transform the B-17, surprise the Luftwaffe, and save thousands of American lives. This is the story of the cheek guns, the battlefield innovation that gave the B-17 its teeth, the fatal flaw. To understand the desperation, one must understand the slaughter. By early 1943, the daylight bombing campaign was teetering on the brink of failure. The B-17F, the workhorse of the fleet, was falling in droves. Luftwaffe aces like Egon Meyer had perfected the head-on pass. They would line up on the nose of the lead bomber, fire a burst of cannon shells, and dive away. The shells would smash through the plexiglass, often killing the pilots or destroying the oxygen systems, causing the plane to fall out of formation where it could be picked apart. Inside the bombers, the frustration was palpable. Waist gunners, manning the heavy .50 caliber Brownings on the sides of the fuselage, stood helpless as fighters ravaged their formation from the front. They could only watch as the enemy planes flashed past, often too fast to track. The rear crew was rendered obsolete by the new German tactics. The men in the nose, the bombardier and navigator, were essentially sitting ducks behind a plate of glass, armed with a pea shooter against armored interceptors. The Army Air Force's USAAF High Command was slow to react. Factory retooling took months, sometimes years. The crews didn't have years. They barely had weeks. The life expectancy of a bomber crewman was roughly 15 missions. They needed a fix, and they needed it now. The battlefield fix. The innovation began not in a wind tunnel, but in the maintenance hangars of the 306th and 91st bomb groups. Desperate ground crews and gunners began to cannibalize their own aircraft to survive. They realized that if the factory wouldn't give them forward firepower, they would have to carve it out themselves. The modification was crude, aggressive, and unauthorized. Mechanics took the heavy .50 caliber machine guns, weapons, capable of tearing a wing off a Messerschmitt, and fashioned heavy mounts for them in the nose. But where to put them? The nose cone was crowded with the Norden bomb. The solution was to cut through the skin of the aircraft itself. Crews hacked holes into the plexiglass or metal framing on either side of the nose, conned the cheeks of the bomber. They fabricated heavy metal brackets, often using scrap steel found on the base, and bolted the massive guns directly into the airframe. It was a nightmare of engineering improvisation. The recoil of a .50 caliber machine gun is tremendous. Firing it from an unreinforced window could crack the plexiglass or tear the mount loose. Crews reinforced the fuselage with extra plating, fashioned rudimentary wind baffles to keep the freezing slipstream out, and rigged ammunition chutes that snaked through the cramped navigator's compartment. Suddenly, the B-17F had fangs. Instead of a single wobbly .30 caliber gun, these modified gunships now packed 2 and sometimes 3 forward-facing .50 caliber heavy machine guns, capable of putting up a wall of lead directly into the path of an oncoming fighter. The trap is sprung. The Luftwaffe had no idea. German intelligence assumed that the B-17s they would meet next week were the same vulnerable prey they had butchered the week before. They believed the Americans were months away from a factory solution. They were wrong. When the modified bombers next flew over the Reich, German fighter squadrons climbed to intercept. Following their standard doctrine, they maneuvered ahead of the bomber stream, turned, and began their deadly head-on run. Pilots like Meyer expected the usual frantic, ineffective pops from a .30 caliber. They expected the bombers to scatter. Instead, they flew into a buzzsaw. As the German fighters committed to their dives, the B-17s opened fire. The new cheek guns, manned by navigators, bombardiers, and sometimes displaced waist gunners, moved forward to help. Erupted. The closing speed of the two aircraft meant that the kinetic energy of the collision was enormous. American .50 caliber rounds, firing at 800 rounds per minute, tore into the engines and cockpits of the attacking Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s. For the German pilots, the shock was total. Planes that had been easy kills suddenly bit back with ferocity. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. The safe avenue of attack had been closed. German formations broke off in confusion. The confident, disciplined head-on passes disintegrated into chaotic skirmishes where the B-17s, now defending from all angles, held the advantage. The transformation of the fortress. This field modification born of desperation and enacted by the men whose lives depended on it fundamentally changed the air war. It bought the 8th Air Force critical time. The success of the cheek guns was so undeniable that Boeing engineers scrambled to incorporate it into the production line. The ultimate validation came with the introduction of the B-17G model later in the war. The G model featured a factory-installed chin turret, a remote-controlled twin .50 caliber turret located under the nose, directly inspired by the desperate needs of the combat crews. But the chin turret arrived late. It was the hacked-out bolted-on cheek guns of 1943 that stemmed the tide during the darkest days of the air war. A legacy of survival. The cheek gun modification saved thousands of lives. It forced the Luftwaffe to abandon their most effective tactic and return to attacking from the rear or beam, where the B-17's waist and tail gunners were waiting for them. It restored the defensive integrity of the combat box formation. But perhaps most importantly, it proved that the American GI was not just a cog in a machine, but an innovator capable of adapting to the harshest realities of war. The waist gunners, mechanics, and crew chiefs who looked at a hopeless situation and decided to cut a hole in their own plane to fight back didn't just modify a bomber, they modified the outcome of the war in the skies. Today, if you look at surviving B-17Fs or early photos of the G model, you can still see the staggered bulging windows on the nose, a permanent scar that serves as a testament to the desperate ingenuity that turned a vulnerable giant into the queen of the skies.